Aiden had always considered himself a rational man. As a data analyst, he relied on logic and patterns to make sense of the world. But nothing could have prepared him for the moment he discovered that his wife, Emily, had been unfaithful. Their marriage, once full of laughter and quiet understanding, had changed over the past year. Emily, a corporate executive, had been working late more often, her business trips becoming more frequent. At first, Aiden chalked it up to her ambition. But the growing distance between them gnawed at him. Then came the night that shattered his world. Returning home early from a business trip, he found an unfamiliar cologne lingering in their bedroom. At first, he dismissed it, but then he saw it, a small, expensive wristwatch resting on her nightstand. It wasn't his. A cold dread settled in his stomach as he picked it up, his mind racing. He checked the brand. It was the kind of watch executives wore. Emily returned home later that night, smiling, oblivious to the storm brewing within him. Aiden had always been calm under pressure, but that night, he couldn't pretend. "Whose watch is this?" he asked, holding it up. Emily's smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his voice eerily steady. "Tell me the truth, Emily." For a moment, she said nothing. Then she sighed, rubbing her temples. "Aiden, it's complicated." The confession came in pieces, wrapped in half-truths and excuses. She claimed it was a mistake, that she had been feeling lonely, overwhelmed by work. But all Aiden could hear was the confirmation of his worst fears. Something inside him broke that night. The next day, Aiden packed his things. He didn't shout. He didn't break things. He simply left. Staying in the same house, in the same life they had built together, was unbearable. He drove for hours, not knowing where he was going until he found himself at the edge of a small mountain town. The crisp air, the quiet streets, it felt like another world, far from the wreckage of his marriage. He checked into a small, rustic inn and stared at the ceiling for hours, wondering what came next. The answer came unexpectedly. While sitting in a dimly lit bar, drowning in his thoughts, an older man sat beside him. His name was Logan, a retired carpenter who owned a plot of land just outside town. They struck up a conversation, and after hearing Aiden's story, Logan made him an offer. "I got a cabin out there," Logan said. "It's not much, but it's quiet. If you need a place to clear your head, it's yours." Aiden hesitated. It was impulsive, reckless even. But maybe that's what he needed. Living in the cabin was an adjustment. The isolation was deafening at first, but it gave Aiden something he hadn't had in a long time: clarity. He spent his days chopping wood, hiking through the hills, and slowly piecing himself back together. The town was small, but the people were welcoming. Logan introduced him to his niece, Sophie, who ran the local bookstore. She was warm, patient, and perceptive. She never pried, but Aiden knew she saw through his quiet facade. "Running away doesn't mean you're lost," she told him one evening over coffee. "Sometimes, it's the only way to find yourself again." He didn't know if he was ready to believe that yet. But for the first time in months, he wanted to try. Months passed, and Aiden found peace in the mountains. But the past had a way of catching up. One morning, he checked his phone to find dozens of missed calls from Emily. Then, a message. "I know where you are. Please, just talk to me." Against his better judgment, he agreed to meet her in town. When she arrived, she looked different, worn down, remorseful. She told him about how her affair had cost her everything: her reputation at work, her friendships, and most of all, him. "I was a fool," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I had to see you. I had to try." Aiden listened, but he felt nothing. The pain had dulled, replaced by something stronger: acceptance. "Emily," he said finally, "we can't go back. And I don't want to." She sobbed, but deep down, he knew she understood. He had spent too much time trying to salvage something broken. Now, it was time to move forward. As she walked away, Aidan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. After his meeting with Emily, Aidan focused on building his new life. Days turned into weeks, and the pain of betrayal faded into the background. He spent his mornings working on the cabin, his afternoons helping Logan with projects, and his evenings enjoying quiet sunsets. Sophie continued to be a steady presence in his life. She was more than just a friend now, she was someone he could trust. They spent more time together, and Aidan began to realize that his heart was healing faster than he had expected. One evening, while they sat on the bookstore's porch sipping coffee, Sophie finally asked, "Do you think you'll ever go back? To the city, I mean." Aidan exhaled, staring at the distant mountains. "I used to think I needed to. But now, I don't know. This place feels more like home than anywhere else." She smiled. "Good. Because I think this town could use someone like you." For the first time in a long time, Aidan smiled back, not out of politeness, but because he truly felt it. Maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't ending, it was only just beginning. Summer arrived, and Aidan began to feel the change within himself more than ever. The cool mountain breeze, the quiet spaces of the land, and the warmth of the people around him had gradually helped him find himself again. Life was no longer just about numbers and spreadsheets. Each passing day, he felt a sense of peace, as though he had finally found the place where he truly belonged. One afternoon, while helping Logan repair the roof of the cabin, Aidan received a call from an unknown number. He hesitated but then answered after the second ring. "Aidan?" "It's Emily," her voice came through softly, sounding as though she was trying to hold back emotions. "How are you?" Aidan paused for a moment, sensing the nervousness in her voice. He wasn't sure if he wanted to engage in this conversation, but after a deep breath, he replied, "I'm okay. What about you?" There was a brief silence on the other end. I just wanted to know if you're okay. I've been thinking about you a lot." A strange feeling stirred in Aidan. He had tried so hard to forget her, to not think about the painful past anymore. But Emily's voice, though vulnerable, held sincerity that he couldn't ignore. "Have you been okay?" Aidan asked, his voice neutral, yet there was a slight edge to it. She took a deep breath. "I've made so many mistakes, Aidan. Can you forgive me?" Aidan felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had learned that forgiveness wasn't always about forgetting, it was about healing. But forgiveness didn't necessarily mean going back to what was broken. "Emily," he spoke calmly, but firmly, "I can't go back to the way things were. I've learned that much. But you have to understand, I don't hate you. I just can't live in that darkness anymore." There was a long pause before Emily sighed, the sound full of regret. "You're right. You have every right to live your own life. I needed to know if you were okay." "Take care of yourself," Aidan said softly. "We both need to move on." The conversation ended without anger, without accusations. Just a quiet understanding. They were both letting go. The days stretched on, and Aidan continued to feel a growing sense of peace. He spent his time fixing the cabin, working with Logan, and taking long walks in the surrounding woods. The weight of his past seemed to melt away with each step he took in the cool, fresh air. He no longer carried the burden of betrayal, but instead, he felt lighter, free to explore the world in ways he never had before. One evening, as he walked into Sophie's bookstore, he noticed that she was sitting on the porch, gazing out toward the mountains, a familiar, but still inviting presence. She looked up as he approached, and her smile felt like a quiet invitation to sit with her in the calm of the evening. "You seem different," Sophie said, handing him a cup of warm coffee. Aidan sat beside her, feeling the comfort of the moment. "I've made a decision. I'm not going back. Not to the city, not to the past. I'm staying here." Sophie looked at him, her eyes reflecting understanding. "So, you found where you belong." Aiden nodded, a feeling of finality settling in. He wasn't just escaping anymore. He was building something new. Something real. "I want to build a life here," Aiden continued. "Not just with work or the cabin, but with people. I want to find new connections, new meaning. I want to see where it takes me." Sophie smiled softly. "Well, then, I think this town could use someone like you." Aiden smiled back, truly meaning it this time. For the first time in a long while, he felt something stir within him, a spark of hope for the future. Maybe the best parts of his story were still ahead of him. The days grew longer as summer stretched into early autumn. Aiden found himself becoming more involved in the life of the small mountain town. He spent mornings working on the cabin, afternoons helping Logan with various projects, and evenings at Sophie's bookstore, often staying late to discuss books, life, and everything in between. It wasn't just the work that grounded him, though. It was the people. The town had a way of drawing you in, making you feel like part of something greater. Aiden had never realized how much he had been missing that sense of belonging in the years he spent chasing success in the city. One crisp evening, Sophie invited Aiden to the town's autumn festival. It was a simple affair, local vendors, music, and food, but the warmth of the community was palpable. As Aiden walked beside Sophie, he found himself laughing more than he had in a long time, feeling the ease of a life he hadn't thought possible. "You should come with me to the pumpkin patch tomorrow," Sophie suggested, her eyes sparkling. "I'm sure Logan would love some pumpkins for the cabin." Aiden chuckled, feeling a sense of comfort in the banter. "I think that's the first time I've ever heard someone say, 'Come to the pumpkin patch,' and not feel like they were joking." Sophie smiled, nudging him lightly. "It's a small town thing. You'll get used to it." As the night went on, they found a spot by the bonfire where the townspeople were gathered, chatting and laughing under the stars. The warmth of the fire contrasted the crisp evening air, and Aiden felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He looked around at the people who had welcomed him without question, who had become part of his healing process without even realizing it. He was no longer a man running away from something, he was a man building something new. A few weeks after the festival, Aiden received a letter. It was from Emily. He hadn't expected to hear from her again, but there it was, in his mailbox, the neat handwriting that had once meant so much to him. He hesitated before opening it. But curiosity won out. The letter was brief, but her words were heavy. She wrote about her struggles after their separation, how she had tried to rebuild her own life, but found herself lost in the same way she had felt before. She mentioned regret, but there was no apology. It was as if she was writing to acknowledge the distance between them, acknowledging that they had both moved on, but she wanted him to know that she hadn't forgotten him, that she still thought about him from time to time. Aiden read the letter twice, each time feeling less and less of the weight it used to carry. There was no anger, no pain anymore. Just a quiet understanding that their paths had separated for a reason. His life had changed in ways he hadn't anticipated, and Emily had become a part of his past, something that was no longer tied to his present or future. He put the letter down on the kitchen counter, staring at it for a long moment. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sad. He just felt nothing. And that, in itself, was freeing. As the seasons began to change, so did Aiden's life. The cabin had become his sanctuary, a place where he could reflect and grow. His bond with Sophie deepened, and he found himself feeling something new, a quiet connection that had begun to blossom into something more. One evening, after a day spent hiking through the surrounding hills, Aiden and Sophie sat on the porch of the bookstore, sipping tea as the sun dipped behind the mountains. "You ever think about what's next?" Sophie asked, her voice soft as she stared at the horizon. Aiden leaned back in his chair, looking up at the stars beginning to twinkle in the sky. "I think about it sometimes. But not in the way I used to, when everything had to have a plan or a destination. I've learned that the future isn't something you can predict. It's something you build, step by step, moment by moment. Sophie smiled, her eyes meeting his. I like that. Aiden turned toward her, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't need to. He was content to live in the now, to embrace the unexpected and take things one day at a time. You know, he said slowly, I'm glad I ended up here. I'm not sure where I would have been if I hadn't taken that leap. Sophie's smile widened, and she reached across the table to place her hand gently over his. I'm glad, too. The night air was cool, but the warmth between them made it feel like the perfect end to a chapter. And though Aiden didn't have all the answers, he knew this, the path ahead was his to walk, and for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face whatever it might bring. Months passed, and the seasons continued their timeless dance, leaves turned from green to gold, then to a carpet of russet brown on the ground. Aiden had settled into his new life, no longer a man in limbo, but one with a quiet sense of purpose. The cabin was no longer just a refuge, it had become home. And the small mountain town, once a place of escape, had transformed into the place where he was building something real, a life, a future, a connection to a community and, perhaps most importantly, to himself. One evening, while walking along the creek that ran behind the cabin, Aiden found himself reflecting on all that had led him to this point. The pain, the heartache, the uncertainty, those were all part of the journey. But they had brought him here, to a place where the air was clean, the stars were bright, and the quiet was a companion rather than a void. He'd come a long way from the man who had left behind the city, searching for peace in the wilderness. What he hadn't expected was that peace would come not from escaping, but from embracing the life he had built, from learning to let go of the past and accept that there were some things you couldn't control. Sophie had become more than just a steady presence in his life. She was a partner in the truest sense of the word, someone he could rely on, someone whose warmth and understanding complemented his own quiet strength. They had spent countless evenings together, talking about everything and nothing, as they slowly built a future based on trust, respect, and a shared vision of what could be. It was one evening, under a sky dotted with stars, as they sat on the porch of the bookstore, that Aiden realized the full scope of how far he had come. Sophie leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you ever think about what you're going to do next? Where this is all going? Aiden smiled, the weight of the question not lost on him. He had asked himself that same thing many times. But now, instead of feeling anxious about the unknown, he felt something else, peace. I used to think I needed to have a plan, to know exactly where I was going, he said, his gaze drifting to the mountains in the distance. But now, I think I'm where I need to be. And that's enough. Sophie's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his in a simple gesture of connection. It's good to know when you're where you belong. Aiden nodded, squeezing her hand gently. Yeah, it really is. For the first time, Aiden realized that life wasn't about avoiding pain or clinging to the past. It wasn't about searching for a perfect future either. It was about learning to embrace the journey, no matter how uncertain or unexpected, and finding contentment in the present. The small moments, the simple pleasures, the people who made life worth living, that was where the true meaning lay. Aiden had learned to let go of the past, to forgive, not just Emily, but himself. He had found freedom in acceptance. And now, with Sophie by his side and a life he was building day by day, he understood that the story wasn't over, it was just beginning. As they sat together, the night unfolding around them, Aiden knew one thing for certain, the future didn't have to be clear to be meaningful. Sometimes, the most important part of the journey was simply taking the next step, without fear, without regret, into whatever came next. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this story. If you did, please hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear what you think. Your feedback really helps me create better content for you. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an update. Thanks again and see you in the next video. Take care.